Right, let's make a start. So, first of all, to say good morning or good afternoon. We're right in the middle of the day here in London. So, wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon to you. Thank you for joining us this morning, this afternoon. And we look forward to spending this next hour with you. And my name is Mike Harris, FCC Consulting, but I'm delighted to be joined by an expert panel who you will see on screen. And at a first for me, it's an all-female panel. So that is a great um, uh, development, and the first time it's happened in doing such webinars and conferences for many years. So welcome to you all. I'll ask you to introduce yourselves in a moment. We'll go around the room and just do those introductions. But it's great to have you here, and thank you for joining. And thank you to the back office team who are making all this happen as we speak. It's never a single person, so thank you all to the back office and Neotas for facilitating this meeting for us today. So, what I wanted to say, just to introduce the topic a little bit to us, is that we're going to be talking about a subject that is a really important subject because we're all aware that there are constantly rising levels of financial crime of all kinds from all sources and just about everywhere around the world. There's no single point that's immune to this whole business of seeing financial crime and the problems it causes to society. And going back to our panel briefly, I know each of them is very passionate about fighting financial crime in the various areas that they're involved with, and we'll obviously be talking about that in some detail as we go on through this webinar. So we're all sharing a common passion, which is to get on top of the rising levels of financial crime. And today we're going to look at this and explore how we can do this in the whole area of financial crime compliance. We've got a wide range of tools at our disposal. We've got a number of stakeholders that are all playing an important part in this. But ultimately, it's increasingly common that we need technology and good data to be able to get on top of this problem and understand some of the trends and what's happening in more detail. And we're going to be particularly looking at the role of open source intelligence. There's an awful lot of information available to us. And we're going to look at how we can perhaps harness that in better ways to get on top of the whole issue of being more effective in our financial crime compliance efforts. So that's what we're going to try and do. We're going to cover a lot of ground. It'll be a conversation. It won't be me just asking questions of our panel, but it'll be a conversation between the panel members that we've got here today. And, hopefully we'll leave you with some takeaways that will be useful in your respective roles. So let's make a start, and let's ask for some introductions in no particular order. And looking at my screen, Jessica, you appear in my top right part of the panel. So can I hand over to you? Tell us about you, what you do, and the company that you work for, etc.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm Jess. I'm Jessica Cath. I head up the financial crime division here at Thistle Initiatives. We are a regulatory compliance consultancy. We do everything reg compliance, but I do the really fun stuff, which is the financial crime prevention part. So we do everything from AML sanctions, fraud, ABC, tax evasion risks, etc. And we work with a huge range of firms, from brand new startups all the way up to really, really large mature firms across a whole different range of sectors. So we've seen a lot of good stuff, but we've also seen a hell of a lot of bad stuff as well. And we're often involved in helping them to improve processes or tool sets or make things more effective and efficient. So hopefully I can come in today with a few examples of good and bad practice as well.
I'm sure you can, Jessica. Thank you for that. And from our pre-chat, I know that you see that entire spectrum. So we'll dive into that and come back to it in a moment. And right, just going round the room, Josie, would you like to take over and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Josie Preston. I'm currently the nominated officer, money laundering reporting officer, and head of AML and CTF for Aspers Casino Group. I've spent the last 20 plus years in the gambling industry in various roles, the last 10 of which in senior AML roles. I've worked for all the big names internationally. I've worked in land-based casinos and also online gambling. And in a previous life, I was a soldier in the intelligence corps of the British Army, and my specialist trade was open source intelligence. So this combines two of my loves, the fighting financial crime and also open source.
Fantastic. Thanks, Josie. Such an interesting background as well, and your experience. We'll come back to this in a moment. The way that we all come into this industry is also different. And last but not least, by any means, Sarah, would you like to say a few words about you, what you do, and a little bit about your background?
Yes, so I'm an analyst and consultant at Neotas. So for those of you who may not have heard of us, Neotas is an enhanced due diligence company, which is based on using open source intelligence technology on top of traditional data sources to conduct all our research. So we've developed a platform which basically combines all open source data sources and connect the dots between different sources to help simplify and make our research more effective. So I joined 9 months ago, and I've been using OSINT practically every day since then. So either by using OSINT in an analyst role to help identify risks for our clients, but also as a consultant to develop like OSINT-based solutions so that other companies can also take advantage of OSINT in their day-to-day activities.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. So we've got a lot of experience in the room at every level. So let's dive in. What I'd like to do to start with is just to sort of give the floor to each of you to talk about some of the themes that you're seeing in the industry, some of the challenges that we face, and also some of the things that you're personally passionate about. Just as an example, in our sort of pre-webinar panel discussions, Jessica, you were talking a lot about risk-based approach, for example, and how you want to see that properly embraced in firms. So perhaps a theme that you can pick up. But let's have an open range discussion to kick us off about the challenges, some of the issues, and some of the things that we need to address to improve. So let's start with you, Jessica, if that's okay.
Yeah, definitely. I think so with open source intelligence, it's so interesting and so fun that a lot of people love it and want to do lots of it. And there's so much you can get out of open source intelligence. There's so much data out there. There's so much you can learn about different problems. But for me, working with different types of firms with different risk profiles, with different sizes of teams, different tool sets available, I quite often caution them to use open source intelligence in a sensible way, depending on what the risk is. And we also don't want to run away with it as well. So to Josie's point, we're not in the military, we're not in the police either. And our role quite often in financial institutions is, our primary role is to spot suspicion and use tools in a sensible way to spot instances of suspicion effectively. So again, that can be using open source intelligence, but to make sure we do it sensibly. So not spending too much time on it, making sure the process is built around it, and making sure you're perhaps not doing too much in that space, but what you are doing is really effective so that you can actually pick out real instances of suspicion, package them up into a nice suspicious activity report and send them across to the NCA, who can do more in terms of their sort of investigations off the back of it. So I always caution firms to remember what their role is here, what they are supposed to be doing, looking for those suspicions, but also to do it in a sensible, effective and cost-effective way.
Thanks, Jessica. So could I ask you this? If you were talking to one of your clients and they asked for a high-level description of what the risk-based approach entails, what would you tell them?
So for me, it's putting the resources, and that is time, cost, money, people, tools, into the areas that are highest risk for your business. So looking at your customers, looking at your geographies, looking at your transactions, looking at how you interact with them, the delivery channels, and assessing what is highest risk, what are the biggest risks in amongst all of those, and putting your resources into spotting those higher risks and dealing with and mitigating those highest risk areas.
So very much not the flat earth approach of everything's treated the same.
Definitely not at all. It makes
Absolutely.
sense. It makes sense from a financial crime risk management perspective, but also from a commercial perspective as well.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. So turning to you, Josie, what are you seeing? What are the trends that sort of you're determined to try and overcome or help with and solve? What are the challenges on your plate at the moment?
So when we leverage open source intelligence to identify suspicious activity, as Jess said, or to conduct due diligence and find out further information about our customer's source of funds and source of wealth, it goes back to the purity of the data that you've gathered up until that point, because these are going to be your leads for your investigation or your online investigation, or whether it's with corporate registries or even radio transmissions. Open source covers a breadth of things, not just the internet. And for the gambling industry, because it's been around for decades, from a data perspective, it started out as a couple of little casinos in Mayfair, and it's grown and grown and grown into this huge machine. And what's happened is, over the years, larger operators have swallowed up smaller operators, independent casinos, and as such, they've absorbed their legacy customer database, which sounds great because you might have a huge database of customers and to market to prospect. But one of the issues with this is all these databases are held on different systems. The data's in different formats. There's no interface between them. As the years have gone by, data points have been collected, so personal data points collected based upon the regulation at the time, what was required to be known at the time. So this has meant that gambling operators have had to adapt and work around these issues. So they've had to build huge data warehouses, as a central repository for all those different systems, so they can make the data accessible and interrogatable, and then conduct huge migration projects, data purification projects, and inevitably a lot of data will have been lost in the course of time. And some of that data may be very pertinent to your open source investigation. There might be leads that might be missing. And in terms of the online gambling industry, that's been built on a foundation of technology since its inception, and it's been in relatively recent times. So they've had the beauty of collecting the data to meet CDD obligations from the start, and everything's automated. And I could give you horrific stories of how things are written down on paper even 5 or 10 years ago in the land-based casino industry. So when a gambling operator now has potentially a land-based casino product, but also an online gambling product, that creates another situation where the data doesn't speak to each other, even though they might have a single wallet where people can gamble online and in a retail sense. And also interrogating these siloed departments between these two offers is quite difficult. So I think that's one of the main challenges for us, is actually obtaining the data points to use as leads going forward for open source investigation.
Yeah, it's a very good point, Josie, because obviously we're all used to the idea of curated data sets, whether we're buying them externally from commercial sources or whether we're compiling those data sets within our own operations that are based on customer data, transactions, and so forth. And of course, relying solely on that, you've highlighted some of the key problems, which are the nature of that data, that it decays, that it gets out of date, that it's incomplete, etc. So I'm going to turn to you here, Sarah, because obviously, you're doing and working with OSINT data sources every day. Why don't you start by giving us a definition? What would you say to someone who asks you the question, what's OSINT, Sarah?
Yeah, so I guess it would take a lot of time to answer that question, but to say it simply, I'd say that OSINT is the process of collecting information from all these different data sources that we've talked about, and then turning it into something that you can use to make informed decisions or to assess threats. So by analyzing and understanding the data. And then if we talk about the different data sources that are involved in OSINT, it's really a huge number of resources. So it can be like traditional databases or corporate records and things that you think about first, but also like social media and news articles and all these type of things. And you might first think that it's everything that comes from Google, for example. So everything we can search from search engines, but that's really only about 5% of everything you can find online. And then it's really when you go into the deep web and the dark web that you're really finding the risk that when you're looking into cases. And also when you think about data sources, it's also important to recognize that these data sources are also always changing. For example, Depop and Vinted are very new like social media platforms that we use quite recently. So it's recognizing that already between different jurisdictions, different data sources will be more or less important. And also that these data sources are changing also based on regulation. So if there's new legal rules that come into hands, they can make data sources more or less accessible, more or less easy to research, which is always important to take into account.
Yeah, thank you. So you're suggesting there that we can access the deep web, even the dark web, and get data points, data inputs, if you like, from a multitude of sources that go beyond even, let's say, Google or other search engines. So how can I ask this? How do you avoid the problem of having too much data, too much information at your disposal to try and make sense of when you're doing some sort of financial crime investigation? How do you filter out the noise?
Yeah, well, I think the noise it can be inevitable, I think, since we use like internet and social media in our daily lives, we're obviously going to have a large amount of data, which is really valuable too, because that's where you can find all the risk, but it's also important to try and find ways to sift through these large amounts of data. So I'd say that this is where technology comes into play. So technological solutions, they can help us make OSINT more accessible and more usable in our day-to-day work. So for example, in the Neotas platform, we have a natural language processing tool, which can help us sift through all, for example, the tweets that someone has posted in order to just find the tweets that have risky content. So instead of spending a lot of time just looking through reading every individual tweet, we can just have or involve technological solutions and NLP and machine learning in order to automate the process. And then I'd also say that maybe human intuition has a role to play. Having an inquisitive mindset is quite useful just to spot discrepancies or help identify patterns. When you're looking at loads of amounts of data, I feel like the human element also has a big role to play in making strategic decisions when looking at data, which can also, I guess, maybe be automated to some extent with technology. I mean, AI has a role to play, for example, when to find patterns, since AI can access a huge amount of data and create ways to identify patterns, which can help automate the process in the future probably. But I think the human element has probably a big role to play still.
Yeah, thank you for that. I absolutely agree with you, Sarah. You know, you cannot eliminate the importance of human intelligence as part of this process. Experience, gut feel, whatever you want to call it, it's so important when you're looking for suspicious activity. Coming back to you, Jessica, and you see, as you said in your introduction, you see a widespread range of practice from good to the bad to probably the indifferent as well. What sort of what's your advice to your clients about how they approach this problem? I mean, we talked about data, we're going to continue to develop that. We talked about technology, we talk about the human aspect as well. What are the important ingredients in effective AML compliance solutions?
Gosh, that's a huge question.
It is a big question.
Maybe if I narrow down in terms of where to start when you're thinking about engaging with open source intelligence and then how to build out the process. Again, it comes back to the risk. So looking at your customer base, if you have a super vanilla product and a super vanilla customer base, you can actually do a surprising amount with Google. Right. And perhaps if you have just vanilla UK-based customers that are doing very vanilla things, maybe that's okay. But even with Google, there are some good ways of using Google and there are some better ways of using Google. Some people use very basic search strings. Some people can do much more complicated things, and you can build that into your process. Again, if you're a smaller firm with a super vanilla product, that might be a good starting point. But of course, as you start to grow and scale and mature, and if you have a risky product or you have high risk customers that might be based in high risk jurisdictions, or they are doing quite high value trades or whatever your product is, you then need to start to think really closely about, do you understand where the source of funds come from? Do you really understand the wealth story? And this is where a lot of these tools can really come into play. And exactly to Sarah's point, there is a limit to how much you can do from the human perspective in terms of crunching and consolidating a lot of data and looking for that one needle in a haystack, that one piece of data that says, actually, this source of wealth might be linked to a drug gang, or that might be linked to something else. And without some of these tools to look in the dark web, you might not have made that connection as easily. And, you know, back in the day, I started my career back at Kroll, which is in corporate investigations and intelligence. And the tools weren't quite so good then. So we were doing a hell of a lot ourselves, and there is a lot that you can do, but it takes time and it takes a lot of skill and it takes a lot of practice to try and find those things without some of the tools available. Now we do have quite a lot of really, really good tools which are starting to pull this together. And there's some great stuff with natural language processing. There's some great stuff with AI managing to, training your models to make sure it's looking for really specific instances that map against the sort of suspicious activity you would expect to see on your platform. But it's down to, when you get to that stage, you really need to understand what tool you're looking to buy or you're looking to use and how you're going to configure it. And my key recommendation at this point is do a lot of due diligence on any vendor that you're looking to use, and really go for it with the questioning when you're starting to engage with them. And look to configure it very closely to your own business. So again, back to your customers, your risk, your product, what are you looking for? And vendors today are more like partners. It's not like buy a tool and use it. It's use them as a partner. So work with them to configure it to exactly what you need. And if you do have any problems or challenges as you start to use the platform, they are your partner as well.
That's really helpful advice, and I think that's something that maybe you'll come back to, Sarah, because that's very much your experience in working with our clients, and working with the sort of people that we talk to on a day-to-day basis in the activities that we do. Josie, can I just ask you to relate what you've heard from Sarah and from Jessica just into the context of the industry that you have so much experience of, because we all recognize, obviously, that the gambling industry is potentially a high-risk industry from a money laundering point of view. Not for the faint-hearted. So give us a flavour of what you have to deal with and some of the challenges that throws up.
So going back to what Sarah and Jess just said about the difference between the human intuition, the human element, and utilizing open source tools. I think open source tools, especially those that's coming into play now, these AI assisted tools, generative AI, it's going to go out and find all these data points and bring it all back to you. I think you can't put a price on the human element to this. I think technology is going to aid us in the collection and collation of all this data, but I think it's still at this moment in time, maybe not in 20 years, 30 years, but I think you need that human for the analytical side, and also the human being understands the risk appetite of the business that you work for, the risk appetite, if you're looking to suspicious activity, what's deemed suspicious, what's not. From my experience, especially with suspicious activity, say if we have a customer who's under suspicion, has been the subject of an internal report, to send AI out to have an interaction with them would not bring back the same value. So, for example, AI couldn't tell you about social norms when they answer questions, social norms, or the absence of social norms, cultural nuances, and something very unique to our industry, which is the difference between superstitious activity and suspicious activity. Those are things that only human beings of observing and have experience in the industry can bring to the table and can sift through. So, for example, if I send an employee, if a customer is under suspicion, I send an employee out to have an interaction, and I'll prime them, say, ask these questions, lead it down this route, maybe set a couple of traps to see if they fall into it. When that interaction's taken place, it is recorded on our system, and obviously AI or technology can pick that up. But what that conversation documented will not tell you is, when I speak to that employee later on, they'll say, he was sweating, he was taking a long time to answer, he was searching, for answers, things that should be, where's your business registered, what's the name of your business, what's your company number, questions like that. He was scratching, he ordered a drink, he was trying to buy time to think about things. He contradicted something he said to me previously, because usually it's the same employees speaking to the same customers, especially if it's a relationship manager, for example. All these things will be documented. I can read it later on, but it's really that human side of the conversation which contributes to my reasoning as to whether something has substantive grounds for suspicion or whether it's not quite there. There's not enough there, and maybe it's just unusual or concerning. So I do think it's a two-pronged attack with both technology, open source intelligence to fact check things that have been said in that interaction, but also we do need that element of gut instinct or that feeling that comes back from the customer facing employees.
Fantastic. And I can see clearly how your military intelligence background comes into play in all of this, Josie. That's so true. We red flags, we tend to think about in sort of, rational terms. But of course, the red flags of visual appearance, behavior, and those sort of human elements are just as important in identifying suspicious activity. So thank you. Point well made. I'm just going to remind the audience that please do be interactive. There's a Q&A button at the top of your screen, and if you'd like to pose a question or make a comment, we'd love to hear from you, so please feel free to use that. We'll try and pick it up as we go along, or alternatively leave some time at the end, but please, we'd love to hear from you and your thoughts around this topic as well. So as I say, the Q&A button at the top is the place to go for that. So I'm going to come back to you, Sarah, here, because as you said in your introduction, you're dealing with and using OSINT every single day. Just tell us a little bit more about what that actually means, what it looks like in day-to-day activity, what sort of things that you're using it for, and give us a few examples, and just tell us a bit about the sort of nature of using OSINT in the work that you do.
Yeah, so that's quite a big question.
I'm good at asking big questions.
Yeah, so, well, basically on our day-to-day, we have a platform which combines loads of different data sources and helps us complete cases. So when we're conducting research into an individual or into a company, so we're looking often, we always look into like traditional sources. So we look through corporate records to try and identify like ownership structures and control structures, find ultimate beneficial owners, those type of things. Then we'd also be looking into the social media footprint of an individual. So what they can be posting online to try and get a more global image of a person. And it's through often the social media footprint that you can find informal networks, which really helps to understand like different elements of a person. So you can see that some individuals may be co-directors in a lot of companies, but it's really those social connections that are more important. For example, you could be finding other companies through family members, or for example, a family member could be a pet or someone like that, or associates. Sometimes they're picked up by traditional databases, sometimes they're not. So it's really through like even just Facebook friends or followers that you can help find additional information. And well, to think about an example, we worked on a case recently where we were looking at domain registry information, so the information behind a company website, and that information helped us to identify additional usernames, additional social media profiles, which helped uncover hidden employment, and all of these created a much bigger picture of the individual. So we had much more information which we could use to then confirm that in adverse media articles that the individual in the case was our subject. And those adverse media articles were about the individual being part of a Turkish mafia group and had been running illegal gambling sites actually, and was laundering money through cryptocurrencies. And so he hadn't obviously disclosed this employment, but through the domain registry information, we found like a username which didn't match his name. Obviously, it was like a special username, which helped us create a much bigger picture. So I'd say that that's the main thing, is that we see a much bigger picture of the individual, which we can use all this information to then go into different social media websites.
Fascinating work, and helps uncover the bad actors that we're all trying to find out there and prevent from getting into our services and financial services and what have you. So thank you for that, Sarah. It's good to bring this to life. So any anecdotes, case studies that we can do without divulging, obviously, confidentiality or confidential information is helpful. So I just want to put it out there to any of you, thinking of examples of how, the sort of thing that you just talked about, Sarah, works in real life, and some of the problems as well, because I hear a lot about the challenge of false positives. That comes across in every sort of sector there, particularly where you've got volumes of transactions or volumes of customers having to be dealt with. And in some of the industries that, Jessica, you deal with, that's a challenge. So how can we improve our performance and dealing with things like false positives and, wrong identity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I will I'll probably leave it to Josie to come back on some really sort of interesting case studies, because we of course don't necessarily see some of the BAU use. We see it when things go wrong. So we often have firms coming to us saying, I've got a huge volume of false positives, or I've got a huge backlog, and often that is too late to be coming to us, and we have to come in and put people on the ground to sort it out. But the key thing that we're seeing on the ground is not configuring any tool that they're using properly, and also patching a lot of tools into their process and their operations, but not necessarily thinking about what tools are right for them, and having too many tools or the wrong tools, and then they're all producing alerts, and are they actually adding value at all? And you have a backlog of alerts, you've got a lot of false positives, and you're still not spotting suspicion, and you've got 10 vendors in your process. So it's really about making sure, and coming back to the point earlier, that there are some really excellent tools out there, but you have to make sure it's the right one for you and it has the right things for you, and it has to be configured to you so that you don't get so many false positives. We are seeing a huge number of false positives across different parts of different processes. So a lot of false positive alerts are onboarding. We're seeing a huge amount in transaction monitoring. And people not being able to keep up with processing all of these alerts. And once you have the alert, you can't just say, actually, we're going to ignore that alert. You have to do something with it. You have to review it. And quite often at the moment, that is putting people in to go and review the alert. Now, there are other ways to use AI to try and trim down those alerts. But once you've got them, you have to deal with them. And that's the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You can't just, as you said, quietly ignore them. So, Josie, how about your experience in this area?
I do have a little anecdote which quite nicely segues in from what Jess was saying. So around I think it was around 2012. I don't want to give too much away, so this is going to be a very general story. So I worked for a high-end casino company that had a casino in Mayfair. And at the time, they had a new customer come in. He was from sort of Levant region, had an entourage, potentially a bodyguard. So we, that kind of pricked our ears up. He was spending a lot of cash at the time, loose cash. So that put him into a higher risk category, just purely on the basis of loose cash use, which is, I'm talking, to give it a context, 10 to hundreds of thousands, not just a couple of grand. So at the time, alongside this, I was following a guy from the UK on social media. I think it was Facebook. Yeah, because he used to do Facebook Live. And he had left the UK to go and fight with the YPG and YPJ, so the Kurdish freedom fighters, because ISIS was quite big at the time. And he used to share a lot of videos, like scenes from the front line, things you wouldn't see on the news. So I used to religiously watch these Facebook Lives. And one day he shared a video of the sort of, before the YPG and YPJ groups would go out to patrol, they had these rituals that they do. So they'd all go in a circle and sing songs, and quite sadly, because they weren't sure that they were all going to come back alive, if you like. So I was just watching this with fascination. And one day he shared a video, and there's been 50 individuals in a circle, and 4 of them were holding a banner. a huge banner piece of cloth with someone's face on, with flowers around it, photoshopped around it, and scrolls and birds and things like that. And I looked at it and I thought, that's the customer that I've just seen 2 days ago. So, okay, so obviously our screening systems and our analysts had not picked up there's potentially PEP exposure there, sanctions exposure, potentially terrorist financing exposure. So, you know, his risk in my mind just shot up. And that's, you know, that's an accidental use of open source to identify those hidden risks. But when I went back and looked at his case, actually, there'd been a couple of mistakes, and this is data purity and screening problem again. In the case, as Jess mentioned, you know, if your fuzzy logic isn't at the right point, you know, things are not going to get picked up. And in this case, the customer had an honorific title, an Arabic honorific title, which we'd never come across before, which I think was specifically a Kurdish kind of title, which had been wrongly entered into the system, the membership system, as his first name. We had also given multiple different forms of ID. The names were in different orders depending on the different ID. They're also spelt differently from the transliteration from Arabic to English. So there was a couple of things that were missed, and screening, you know, hadn't been conducted in all the different names and the different orders to make sure that we pick things up. And nicely at the end, so we thought, okay, so we've got these potential risks. We know where our weaknesses are, where we've kind of gone wrong with this one, and then we conducted open source, just organic searches to kind of identify who this person was. Were they politically exposed? Quite an old guy, but they had some really distinguishing features, and that's why I don't want to give them away, but that's how we knew it was definitely the person that I'd seen on the video. And so we conducted open source to find out whether there was any residual political exposure, because the guy was late into, I think, 70s probably at that time. And we did identify he's kind of a national treasure for certain groups within Kurdistan. So, you know, I think that's just a beautiful example of how to identify hidden risks and then also mitigate and investigate them at the end using open source at both the start and the end of the journey. So that was quite a that one stuck in my mind for a long
Yeah,
time.
and I can understand why, Josie, you know, and thank goodness of your own personal vigilance in that process that alerted it in the first place. But it does expose the weaknesses of our, you know, initial onboarding processes if we don't A, have them done correctly, and B, you know, and this is down to training of analysts. It's also down to obviously the tools that people have at their disposal and how far we're prepared to go. But it also ties back with what you started with, Jessica, which is proper implementation of a risk-based approach, because ultimately, you know, we're never going to be perfect, but we've got to I guess improve the odds of identifying these sort of actors at the initial stages. Anything you'd like to follow up on from that anecdote, Jessica?
I think that's an excellent anecdote, and actually touches upon somebody's question in the question box around the use of things like social media versus official records, because and
sorry, just a quick pause there. Let's just for the audience benefit, just say what this question is asking. It's saying that in traditional due diligence, there's been a limited reliance on social media sources and increased reliance on official records / data sources. However, with the whole social media landscape changing and evolving over the past few years, the question is, how do we view that social media intelligence would aid the traditional due diligence processes? So sorry, just to interrupt you there, Jessica, but just to give the context of the question to the audience, it's an important one touched on by you, Sarah, a few minutes ago.
It's a great question, and to me it actually comes down to us moving away from the simple process tick box approach and actually having more flexibility to try and identify suspicion in an effective way. So the worst processes I see are firms that try to make very simple tick box processes. So they will, in your onboarding journey, it's very simple. The analysts are literally sticking to machine processes. You do one thing, you check another, you go to an official source, and it's done. That's not it's not the best approach. And whilst we need to get the balance right between creating processes that are still simple enough and efficient processes, you always, particularly in higher risk scenarios, need to have the flexibility to do the right, to make the right steps in your investigation. And using things like social media, there's such great data sources, and there's a lot of different tooling that you can use to try and consolidate a lot of the information from social media. But it has to be used in an intelligent way. So you have to assess whether or not you can rely upon the information that you found on different social media platforms in the same way as, the official records. Probably not, but there's a lot that you can get from social media. So I think when building out journeys where you are looking for that suspicion, it's not about just looking at your official sources. It's looking at what is your risk, what are your customer base, what's your product set, and then building a process that maps to that, and giving your analysts, particularly your second line, the flexibility to do the investigations that they need to find those steps, but also whilst not becoming the police. So, also learning when to stop. But hopefully that gives a sense of the question.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I think the use of social media content is always going to be controversial for obvious reasons. And I'll come back to you on this, Sarah, because there has to be safeguards in place in accessing social media data, because, as you said before, you use it extensively in your research. But there are fine lines, and there are laws and data privacy laws and regulations in place to protect identity of individuals. So where are the boundaries in this? And can you tell us a little bit about, what is acceptable practice in social media and where those boundaries are a little bit? And picking up on the point that Jessica just made, because you talked to me about this in our preparation about, we're not the police, to requote what Jessica just said. There's a supportive role in open source intelligence, but it's not the definitive evidence for prosecution, if I could put it like that. So big question again, but pick up on those themes about the validity of social media and how we can be sure we don't cross boundaries.
Well, I think this is where the regulatory sphere plays a big role. So all the new EU GDPR and UK GDPR, all these regulations are very important in limiting what we can access. And it's true that social media is a big part of our personal lives. So I think it is important to, obviously OSINT is about publicly accessible information. So this is where I think the line is between OSINT and hacking. So we're not hacking people's social media profiles. And I think, it's maybe important to mention. People do have a role to play also in keeping their information private. I think it's important that all social media platforms are moving towards a more, they're giving more access to users to protect their data. And then us too, in the data that we capture, we also have to comply to GDPR regulations. So I think those are all important aspects, but I think it's still important to keep social media as an element we use, because it does really provide a different image of the company or person you're investigating. There's a lot of information. If you're onboarding clients, for example, you're going to get the traditional name, date of birth, and passport number, but it doesn't really tell you much about the person. I think if it's someone that is, for example, vocal on social media, or that's also another thing to take into account, people do express political views, so it's important to not have bias when you're researching, and to separate your own biases and stereotypes when you're researching information. But it does still provide a bigger picture on the person, so it's still important to take into account, but obviously within regulatory frameworks it's important to respect.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful, Sarah. And that's a nice little segue there to my next topic, which is to ask, I think particularly this is for Jessica and for Josie, who operate, or indirectly, into highly regulated customers, AML regulated businesses around the world. Just a few comments from you both, if you would, about the role of the regulator, about regulation. Does it help? Is it a help, or is it a hindrance? What could we improve to, I guess, improve our detection rates of financial crime, and also, recovery of illegal assets? The reported stats are always horrendously low, and I think, my goodness, all this effort for very little return ultimately. But that doesn't stop us trying to do better. What should we do better? Another big question. Who'd like to start on that one?
I mean, so from my perspective, I actually think the regulatory frameworks are not terrible. Everyone likes to say that regulation is awful and it's stopping business. I actually think in this area, it's not too bad. The new Economic Crime Act has got some good changes in it that allows the facilitation of data sharing. We're just not using it very well yet. And there's a lot of hesitation in the industry about looking to share intelligence and data in different ways. But I actually think the regulatory framework is not too bad. We just need to start getting better at using it. In terms of the detection levels and why we're failing miserably at that side, I think the NCA needs to have more resources. But looking back at data sharing, I think that's one bit that we need to get better at now. So we do have the flexibility to share different data points, but the hesitation is, of course, on the GDPR privacy point, that we need to be careful when sharing information. I genuinely don't think we're going to make much more headway in terms of preventing financial crime until we are able to share more data between institutions. So at the moment, you'll have a firm operating in a silo looking for suspicion within their own data set. You'll have another firm working in a silo looking at their own transactions and their own customers looking for suspicion. And unless you are HSBC with vast amounts of data, you are seeing a small part of what could be a much larger network. So it's about sharing more information between institutions, but that has to be done in the right way. The fear that I have is that if you're only sharing data once you've already confirmed a suspicion, or you think it's suspicious, you're applying your own risk-based decision onto that piece of data and then sharing it with another firm. But if you've made the wrong decision, that customer might be unable to access financial services and become a vulnerable customer because of a decision that another firm has made, and they're sharing that information between them. So there's a lot that we need to think about in this space about how we start to share information between firms and institutions. But for now, we can definitely get better at sharing typologies. So sharing, examples without names, without dates of birth, without addresses, of sorts of patterns, of sorts of things that we're spotting. So, in Josie's case, you might say, well, we're seeing people from this jurisdiction and they're coming in with, £10,000 in cash and they're coming in twice a week. I don't know, that sort of thing. And then that would be shared within the industry. So there are things that we can definitely get better at sharing.
Very good points. Thanks, Jessica. Josie, your thoughts?
Just following on from that, with the ECCTA provisions for intelligence sharing, I think the gambling industry, we have a gambling AML group which sits as part of the Betting and Gaming Council. And we've had many discussions about this. It's like a really hot topic for us at the moment, but there's this kind of legacy issue with especially casino operators, but gaming operators in general, given the value of certain customers who will gamble anywhere, that what happens when we share this information, say we have a suspicion, we've submitted an external side to the NCA about a customer, we share that information with another operator, they might not want to follow suit with us. They might think, brilliant, they're not going to visit you anymore, then we'll get all their money. And it's about, I think, and this has been a hot topic really, and it's something that in our industry that the boards have to decide. I think it comes back to having a really robust risk appetite statement, a really robust risk appetite profile, because the danger is that when we share this intelligence and share this information, that goalposts get moved to suit certain individuals because of the value can be in the millions per day. So there's a lot of issues probably with the data sharing from a commercial point of view, but also it does create difficulties for other MLROs and chief risk officers who have to sort of manage the risks and manage the intelligence coming in from other operators, but also manage the expectation of the board with regards to commercial imperatives. So I think it's going to be not as easy as it sounds for us, but yeah, I think it's positive. We've always, I mean, I shouldn't say this out loud, but we've always had a sort of hotline between the MLROs in the industry, where we've said exactly what Jess said. Do you know some Turkish people that come in with 10 grand? Yeah. And it's just like a nudge. We don't break GDPR in any case. We do have indicators that we share customers, and that's because when you cash out or win in a casino in cash, you're presented with a sealed packet which is branded with that operator's logo. So if we receive packets from the other operator into our business, we know that they're a shared customer, and also we can pick up that conversation. So I think it's very positive. It's just that getting a board of directors of respective businesses to agree to it, in a sense.
Well, absolutely. I've always said there are two very powerful words that impact this industry, and they're called vested interests.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
unfortunately, they still have an impact on, the willingness of all stakeholders to be absolutely transparent and absolutely involved, and in information sharing and anything else that would, ultimately have an impact on their particular operational business. So I think we've got some challenges to overcome, that's for sure. So coming back to you, Sarah, little bit about some of the work you do, you've shared with us. Have you got any particular examples, anything that you've highlighted from recent work? What areas do you see that are most frequent in terms of the sorts of cases that you're dealing with? You shared a few of those thoughts, when we were chatting in the pre-panel preparation, but some of the sort of weaknesses that are exploited by financial criminals, people with ill intent. What typically comes out?
Yeah, I think what criminals are exploiting, I'd say that I think they can rely on the fact that there isn't a lot of data sharing that is going on. So I think that criminals can use that, for example, especially, I mean, we were talking like on a national jurisdiction basis, but like social media and OSINT has really no borders. So most criminals who operate in one country are mostly, like when we conduct research on individuals, we're always conducting on 4+ jurisdictions, our research of people who are implemented everywhere, people who have companies everywhere. So that's really where we find a lot of risk. So I'd say that in that sense, they're exploiting really the fact that there isn't a lot of data sharing between countries, which is even harder, I think, to implement than the data sharing like between institutions. And I think also I think they can also exploit all the privacy requirements like the GDPR and stuff like that, is also things like by keeping things on private, that's things that we can't access in open source intelligence. So there is a lot of obstacles that are always coming out. And I think I'd say even on maybe on a monthly basis, we change like our methods, or we recognize that some things aren't accessible, but that also means that other things are becoming accessible. So it's always like staying on top of these changes that are happening, following trends, seeing what's becoming more popular, what people are using, a lot of information people actually don't know is out there on themselves. So I think it's always trying to stay on top of that. But it is, hard to stay on top of the criminals. I say most of the risk we find, I think, is all these hidden employments and things like that are linked to other companies, because the information we can get is people declaring their employments, but obviously the employments that they want to declare. So it's really looking for things that they haven't declared, and those are often linked to loads of other risk things.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Interestingly, just before we started this webinar, I was glancing at the screen that I have that provides news input, news feed for, let's call it, financial crime stories, that are emerging and evolving around the world. And today alone, there were 10 news stories that were on that page. And every one of them is probably the tip of an iceberg, so clearly, as you make the point very well, things are constantly evolving, constantly changing, and it's really important that, as professionals in this industry, that we keep on top of those. Any advice in that respect? I mean, we're coming towards the end of our time now, so I'd like just to go around the room and ask each of you for your thoughts, your advice to the audience, your tips, your takeaways, anything that you think might be helpful. But I'd also like to ask you each to just put a little plug in here, because as I said at the very beginning, it's a real privilege to share this with an all-female panel of experts. And when I started in this industry many years ago, sadly, you were a rare species. It was very much a male orientated. So just give a word of encouragement to all the women in the audience and others, who will hopefully listen to this afterwards, about coming in and the reasons for coming into this sector. So I want a little plug for it, as well as your top tip. So Jessica, I'm going to start with you.
So top tips around the use of open source intelligence. It's very, very useful. There's a lot of good things, but don't get carried away. So back to the risk-based approach point right at the beginning, look at your risks, make sure you build a process using open source intelligence that's proportionate to the risk that you face, and do it in a commercial way, because ultimately we're businesses at the end of the day, and we need to prevent financial crime within that business context. So it's really handy. It's very, very useful, but do it in a sensible way and don't get carried away. And we're not the police. A word of encouragement. This industry is super interesting. It is so interesting, and it's constantly changing, and I'm forever doing things that are completely different every single day. Every single hour of my day is different. So a huge shout out to the industry, and I'm always happy to have conversations with any new people that look at the industry. I frequently talk to people just coming out of university and looking to start in this space. So yeah, feel free to get in touch.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jessica. Josie.
Yeah, so I think a key takeaway or a bit of advice that I would give is that open source intelligence support, leveraging open source intelligence to support your investigations is not a tick box approach. It shouldn't be that you hand your analysts a list of, look on Companies House, look on this register, look on this. You should be empowering your team, especially second line teams, to be taking the leads, forming a collection plan, as Jess says, to prevent going too far and going beyond. So there's targeted investigation, and you get the answers to what you're looking for, or you uncover something that you didn't know. And I think that kind of investigative process and strategy is really, really important. And I think if you train your teams in this way, the documentation of how the outputs of your research as well are really important, because they may be used later on for regulatory assessment or just for evidence, supplementary evidence. And I think it's a great field. I've been doing it for a long time, longer than I care to remember, and I just think it's useful in all walks of life as well. Now, for something, if you're going to plan a holiday and you want the cheapest holiday, you can look and get the cheapest flights, get the cheapest accommodation, and it can be utilized to, for any effect. Motivation wise, for the ladies out there, I think we discussed this before, Michael, was that when I was in the military, I think it was 4% female, but actually in the intelligence corps of the British Army at that time, it was 1 in 4 in our battalions were female. And I think women, I don't want to be sexist here or biased or whatever, but I think women are just naturally very good at this stuff, and their approach is very different to, I think they have better time managing with grey areas and unknowns. Can't say that across the board, but I think, working in open source intelligence and also, the anti-financial crime industry is just so fascinating. And, they say, if you love what you do, you never work a day in your life. And I think I would advise anyone to, just go ahead. If that's if you've got an interest in this field, just go for it.
Thank you, Josie. Words of wisdom. Sarah, as a relatively new entrant into the industry, how would you express it?
Yeah, so as a key takeaway, I agree with what Jessica and Josie have said. I think appreciating the value of what OSINT can bring is really important, but also always try and innovate and finding new approaches to be able to sift through all this vast amount of information quickly. So whether that be technology or risk-based approach or human intuition and having a clear research process, I think those are all things to implement into your research. And then a word of encouragement, not a particular academic background is required to be interested in OSINT, because when I think about our team of analysts, we have people coming from political science backgrounds, hard science background, economics, physics. Like the people have been doing all sorts before joining the team. So I think it's just being curious and having an interest for investigations and always looking for new ways to investigate, really.
Thank you, ladies. Thank you. And I think in all of this, we'd all say that we need a balance. We need everything, in balance, which is great. We all bring different skills, backgrounds, etc. But ultimately, we're all trying to do a little bit of good in this industry. And I think everything that everybody that works in it can do to turn the tide against this financial crime disease that we've talked about, it is a good thing, and that's one of the sort of altruistic reasons. So we're up on time. I just want to obviously thank the audience for joining us today. I want to thank the panel, clearly, Josie, Jessica, Sarah, for your input and your thoughts today. It's been fascinating, really helpful, and to thank Neotas for hosting this for us today. Obviously, it's not an advertorial as such, but I would encourage you to have a look at Neotas. Neotas.com is the website, and the work that it does, leading edge, cutting edge stuff, all trying to make a difference in society in what we do, obviously with the commercial purpose. But thank you for joining us, and we'll say goodbye and enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.